It was my birthday recently, and I had put a number of different movies, Blu-ray movies, on a birthday list. And of these movies that I've had on a possible birthday list, because that's one of the things that I still like, physical media. And I think there's a current trend towards physical media these days away from streaming, because a lot of the streaming platforms are going down in quality, um, as a process of late stage capitalist enshittification. Um, Certain movies which used to be available on streaming services aren't, and a lot of streaming services have been downsizing their whole catalogs and stuff like that. And one of the movies that used to be available on streaming but is no longer was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. The Star Trek motion picture series, um, which started before Star Trek Next Generation in the 80s, um, is something that I guess it's just not very popular anymore. It's not on the stream where I live, anyways. They took it off the streaming service. I guess if I got into, maybe I can trick a VPN into getting it from another country or something. I don't know, but I haven't tried that. I had this craving to watch Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, because I have to admit, I grew up with the original Star Trek motion picture series, and Wrath of Khan was obviously one of the best, right? And I have to admit, though, that there is an interesting phenomenon about, getting this on Blu-ray and watching it in high def, probably for the first time in years. And just, it's like a different experience seeing such a high resolution image compared to the grainy, like, kind of background, right? And one of the, there's a particular, I started noticing things, right? Or there's certain things that um, I started noticing, namely a certain resonance or similarity with everyone's favorite anime, Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now, the first thing that I realize is that it's kind of obvious that in the Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, they have a machine called the Genesis device. And the idea of the book of Genesis, the Genesis device takes a dead, lifeless planet and creates life instantly. And then, like, the next day, you've got a planet teeming with a biodiverse ecosystem just out of nowhere. So that was one of the features of plot devices of Star Trek. The basic plot of Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan was that, a woman and her son are working on a research project, and this woman and her son are played, I think, by Gene Roddenberry's wife and Gene Roddenberry's son, if my memory serves me correct. And the two of them have invented this device which could be used to transform a dead planet into a living biodiverse one instantly, basically overnight, anyways. And the there's a nearby, um, character named Khan, who was he was a genetically enhanced super soldier who, in the Star Trek universe, was sent on a space mission in 1996. So it's basically, the idea is that Khan, who borrows his namesake from, of course, Genghis Khan, the old barbarian warlord, right? Is a It's a reference back to our modern times and how kind of like barbaric we are compared to the advanced society that's portrayed to us in the Star Trek series. Um, and it is also, of course, there's this thing that we do in, that's become popular in our media, to the extent that it's starting to feel like we've gone in a kind of a tailspin, where we're just going in a cycle of just repeating the same thing over and over again, getting stuck on nostalgia. And, like, for example, Star Trek was subject to a reboot where they decided to reboot the whole original Captain Kirk and Spock franchise with a series of new movies and all this kind of stuff. And um, as somebody who grew up with the original Star Trek movies, I just was never that impressed with the Star Trek reboot. It just didn't really do it for me. Um, and it doesn't hold the same significance as to actually see William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy doing their thing, right? But that being said, I also think by being an adult now and watching this movie again, it doesn't really hold up in the same way. It doesn't like something about me as a child where it was more appropriate, and now it just seems like maybe a bit of nostalgia, right? But nonetheless, there was something that I had some sort of craving to watch this movie. I don't know why. Maybe because because it's just like ingrained in my brain as like it's like one of those things when you watch the Star Trek movies as a child. There's some part of my brain that's just sort of like conditioned by Wrath of Khan, right? And there's something about just that familiarity of it that I just had to watch it again. It's been too long. But one thing I noticed, anyways, the Evangelion connection, right? Neon Genesis Evangelion. There's something about Neon Genesis Evangelion where a lot of the scenes is a mecha anime, basically, where you have giant robots fighting and they are being guided from this command station. And the command station is sort of like, it looks like it's kind of more inspired by the bridge of like a starship or something like that. And there are all these people sitting at uniforms, and they have the main thing that I noticed, anyways, is that one of the things that I love about Neon Genesis Evangelion is that they have these close-up shots of these infographics or these sort of like graphical computer representations, which are very colorful and bright and stimulating, and it just there's something about they create part of the Neon Genesis Evangelion aesthetic, which is just what can you say? That's part of what makes that anime series pop. If you ask me, and what I realized when watching Star Trek Wrath of Khan was that there's a kind of uncanny resemblance between like the stuff that's put right in your face in Neon Genesis Evangelion is something which is hiding in the background, right, of Star Trek Wrath of Khan. Like there's some kind of like the colorful lights and flashing displays are like these things that are hiding in the background, but Neon Genesis Evangelion takes those and sticks the camera right up to it, so you get to see what it's saying and see what all the lines are doing, and not just have it like some plastic thing which you can kind of tell doesn't mean anything blinking away in the background, right? And that is like but there's something about not just the fact that the presence of those things, but like they actually look the same. They have the same colors, they have some of the same patterns, or they have the same aesthetic quality, and then there's also like the Star Trek uniform thing, right? So I thought I'd mention that, and then that got me. And then there's that, and also the word Genesis, the biblical reference. So there's the presence of those heads-up displays with the flashing infographics. There's the name Genesis, which is the biblical reference, and the idea of some project, science, maybe like a science project that does this thing that radically transforms a planet, and then using the birth of life of Genesis to be can you see? Okay, the pattern is not just one thing, but a bunch of things, right? Now, on top of that, you've got when I was a little kid and I watched, one thing that's interesting about watching Star Trek Wrath of Khan is that I was not, as a little kid, I didn't pay attention to this conversation about ego, right? You have Spock introduced in this one as a guy who is meditating. He's presented like some kind of like a Zen monk or something, right? And there's this idea underlying the conversation between Captain Kirk and Spock, that Vulcans claim to have transcended their ego, and by transcending the ego, what that means is that instead of being wrapped up on the the small passions, right? The small passions of human existence, of envy, jealousy, revenge, bitterness, anger, desire, all this kind, like the Vulcans, those emotions had caused so much destruction for the Vulcans in their history that they have a very strict, disciplined kind of religious thing going with the Vulcans to keep the potential passions at bay, right? And in the Star Trek universe, this is contrasted with the Romulans, who are like the Vulcans that are the bad guys. There are closely related cousins of the Vulcans who are more antagonistic generally in the Star Trek series, but the premise is that they're more antagonistic because these guys just didn't do as good of a job of keeping their small human passions, their desire for power, or their, all that kind of stuff at bay, right? So they are more victim to their own power drives or their own jealousy or their own kind of like plotting and scheming. The Romulans are always the ones that have some sort of like hidden plot in the background. They're pulling the strings to try to get more power. Whereas the Vulcans are kind of more about purifying themselves from those kinds of things, to devoting themselves to the ideal of rationality. And so it's kind of interesting because oftentimes in a conversation, there's often this thing where people make a dichotomy between science and religion, right? Science and religion religion seem to be some old superstition, or to be seen as a kind of infantile regression. Like, it's like you want to go back to being a child, to crawl inside your mother's womb, and like that impulse you associate with a god of infinite love and acceptance, right? It's basically you just want your mama, and you project that onto somebody like Jesus Christ or Krishna or the Buddha, and that's what the Freudian take on it is anyways, right? There's this kind of thing that the scientific approach basically reduces all the religious yearnings to some kind of like regressive, an old thing we've developed out of, and we're instead going towards this world of pure scientific rationality, where logic and rationality rule supreme. And but the thing that's interesting about the Vulcan is the Vulcan represents an alien being who does not relate to the religion and science as being things which are so fundamentally opposed and dichotomous as the human being does. Because the human being finds himself in a position, you got stuff like, Galileo or something, right? Where you've that historical events which have created a sense of hostility, where the scientific discovery or the scientific claim is seen to be in some sort of contrast with the old order of the church, right? And the Galileo thing is a whole can of worms. I'm not going to get into that right now. But the main thing about this is that from the science fiction of Star Trek, from the Vulcan point of view, the Vulcans see the impulse towards a rationalistic, logical approach to life as being aligned with the principle to transcend suffering, right? Because there's an idea that the petty passions of greed and envy and power drive and all this kind of stuff just create cycles of pain and suffering, and to dissociate or to transcend those drives or keep them in check gives them an ability to approach the situation from a position of pure logic. And the position of pure logic in this movie particularly, Spock uses this line about how the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one, right? Now, there's something else that I would like to point out, in that the Star Trek has become associated with a kind of coding of progressivism, where Gene Roddenberry's project with Star Trek is basically, there's a certain anti-woke backlash going on right now, otherwise known as the culture war. And to be fair, I don't really feel I don't know. For me, it feels like maybe a mistake to put myself in the firing line of the culture war or whatever. But I was raised by Star Trek loving parents who promoted the progressive values of Star Trek, and I'm still basically, I'm feeling like there's a potentially a hostile world where people aren't sympathetic to this anymore, right? That seems to be the climate right now, right? That there's some kind of like the world out there is a bunch of people who just want to like swear and cuss and drive their pickup trucks, and they don't want some manager telling them to be more politically correct, or some like kindergarten school teacher mom saying that's not how we do this here, boys. Like we're gonna have to, like, this is kind of the vibe these days, right? So, but I've always loved Star Trek. There's a basic principle of Star Trek of the multicultural diversity and inclusion and stuff like that, which has been coded as basically woke progressivism. But the thing is, not only that, there's this thing which sometimes the really right wing conservative guys get their panties in a knot about cultural Marxism, right? And I was just noticing there's something interesting about Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, for me, that I've always noticed, in that the uniforms in this movie are all red. And not only that, but if you watch the following movies, Star Trek II, all the way to, I don't know, at least Star Trek VI, so that's like 4 movies at least, maybe 5 movies. I can't remember what point they changed the uniforms. Eventually, when she gets, I think it's when you get into the next generation stuff. When you leave, as long as they had Captain Kirk in the motion picture series, they had these red uniforms. But Star Trek One, they had a different outfit design that they didn't go with. Right, the first Star Trek motion picture, they scrapped that whole uniform. And then the original series of Star Trek in the 1960s, you had Captain Kirk wearing a green yellow kind of uniform as the captain. You had Bones McCoy and Leonard Nimoy's Spock wearing blue uniforms, indicating that Spock was a science officer and that McCoy was a doctor, right? So there's a kind of medical and science coded as blue, and then there is this whole thing in Star Trek about the red shirts, right? And the red shirts, you had Scotty wearing a red shirt, as well as the whole security force, right? And so Scotty was the engineer. So the red shirts were engineers. But there's also some kind of implication. I can't remember. Was Scotty both an engineer and the security officer? Because what you saw in the Next Generation, we ended up having like Worf as the security officer and Geordi LaForge as the engineer in the Next Generation, right? But when you stick with Star Trek, the original series, you had this trope about the red shirts, which was basically this. To be fair, it's basically the Star Trek equivalent of the stormtroopers. Right? There's a joke in Star Wars that the stormtroopers weren't able to shoot at all. You'd have their heroes facing a whole squadron of stormtroopers, and they'd never be able to hit their target. The heroes would always get away unscathed, and that this just meant that the stormtroopers were lousy shots, and that they were also stormtroopers who were very easy to kill as well, right? But the equivalent of this in Star Trek is, but the thing is kind of interesting because the stormtroopers were the bad guys, the antagonists in Star Wars. In Star Trek, the red shirts were the good guys. They were the security force of the Enterprise. They were the guys on your team that were going to die, right? And there's something that I think they kind of play off this in some way, where instead of having, because you have this sort of, what you end up in Star Trek, you end up with a sense, Star Trek 1960s, of a certain class strata, where you have it's like the red shirts are the working class, and that the green shirts are like the professional managerial class, and the blue shirts are like the science and well, I guess engineering would be, science as well, though, right? But there's something about how the Spock and McCoy are up until Wrath of Khan, Spock and McCoy never have to worry about dying, but all these red shirts are basically disposable, right? And there's so it's interesting. What I'm you can kind of see where I'm going with this because Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan is famous for the scene where Spock dies, but the thing is, the next movie is Star Trek III, In Search for Spock, where the Genesis device, which brings life to the planet and terraforms it in a day, they also torpedo Spock's dead body there, and then like bring Spock back to life with this technology, and then Spock is back with them, right? So, as a kind, but he's kind of a reborn version, right? A new recreated Spock or whatever, right? So, but there's this whole conversation about ego, right? And that Spock sacrifices himself to stop a radiation leak in the engineering room out of the selflessness of his ego, right? But the thing is, in this context, the idea here is that for the red shirts' perspective, the red shirts are basically like fodder. They just die all the time, anyways, right? The red shirts, and there's specifically in this movie, Scotty, the chief engineering officer, introduces Captain Kirk to his son. Not his son, it's like his nephew. It's his sister's kid, I think he says, right? And he's a new recruit. He's like wet behind the ears, kind of, fresh recruit on the job kind of thing, right? And so in the encounter with Khan, when they have a dramatic spaceship duel in outer space, the photon torpedoes and lasers from the USS Reliant piloted a ship that was commandeered, pirated, you could say, by Khan and his crew, ends up one of the casualties on the attack on the Enterprise is this poor kid who is Scotty's son. And there's something about the way that Captain Kirk responds to the death of. He seems kind of aloof about it, let's say. There's something, I don't know, it's kind of an odd scene to watch, but I realize that they're kind of doing this on purpose because they were trying to highlight something about how Captain Kirk is kind of disconnected from the realities of life and death, and that even when his own people, the red shirts, die, he, it doesn't really it wouldn't affect him on the level as if his dear friend died, right? And so there's something about the playing with your expectations, right? Where we treat death and stuff like that, or the idea that there's these people that are normalized as people that are just cannon fodder, that are there on the front lines, that are the red shirts that die, and then you're in some sort of like class superiority where you and your friends never have to worry about that, and then suddenly you do, right? But it's also kind of interesting because I'm remembering, like Slavoj Zizek. There's certain. I watch Slavoj Zizek videos, but it gets a bit repetitive. I don't know if I just watch the same clips over or he tells the same stories. But there's this one thing that Slavoj Zizek talks about. How about the it's like this Ram Dass stuff about becoming nobody, right? In that there's the idea of like sacrificing the ego, right? Being like or there's this funny thing about spirituality, and this going into this, like, as I'm a little kid, I'm not like, you can imagine me as a little kid, I'm not that literate about the psychological concepts of ego and spirituality or anything like that yet. But this is in the movie. They're talking about ego in terms of like Khan, like there's Khan is polarized with Spock, as Spock is beyond the petty emotions, the petty rivalries, the petty drive for revenge or getting, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that kind of stuff. But because Khan represents a person, it's a critique of our time, right? Somebody from like 1996, right? Which would be the future from the position of the 60s, but would be the time when I grew up in present, when I was a kid. There was the idea that somebody from our present time would be considered to be so barbaric to this advanced civilization portrayed in Star Trek, right? And that the barbarism of Khan is associated with this petty ego shit where Khan will make stupid strategic moves just because he is too driven for revenge, that he's not thinking clearly, right? Making strategic. Khan is actually fairly easy to defeat in this movie. They trick him by dragging him into a nebula, doing some. It's not really that they don't have to do that much work, I don't think, to defeat Khan in this movie, right? And this is basically shown that the more difficult thing is not defeating Khan, but it's Spock's sacrifice of his ego for the greater good, right? But the thing where I'm getting into this is that the thing about the Zizekian thing is talking about how there's a kind of like I'll compare this in another way. I have to admit that I had an experience once dealing with psychiatrists and whatnot, right? Who invoked the whole idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that you've got your basic survival needs, your human survival needs, where you need shelter, you need clothing, you need food, you need water, and that's your basic. If you don't have those, you're going to prioritize those, right? And then on top of that, then you have certain things that come with education and stuff like that, which are important resources for humans to have. But if you are like in a desert island, you're not gonna, it's like there's survival at the desert island level versus survival at the university campus level, right? So if you can't, so there's these certain, you have to have your basic structure of material security before you can get into higher learning and higher education and higher advancement and stuff like that, right? And so basically in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's this idea of what you would call like the spiritual impulse for self-realization is placed as like the pinnacle on top of the pyramid, that it surpasses the basic survival needs, it surpasses the university, so you have to be, it's only for the really refined elite of society that to have the opportunity to have self-realization, which is but that is a kind of a paradox, because once you get to that level, it's like you climb up to the top of the mountain, but then you realize you are actually nothing. It's not you are a you are just the one that needs to be sacrificed for the greater good of the many, right? And that Spock has been able to transcend his own materialistic attachment and clinging to the point that he's willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, right? However, there's a funny thing in that it's not really the ultimate sacrifice, because they just bring him back the next movie. There's no consequence in it, right? There's no real, they don't actually have to live with the grief that they're like, you just killed off the best character in Star Trek 2 and now you've got like fucking 10, how many movies are you going to do without Spock now? They don't want to live with that reality of death, so that the death in Star Trek 2, Wrath of Khan, you do all this thing to be like, oh, we're going to, we reached the top of the pyramid, we reached the supreme attainment that's reserved for so few, but realizing that we are nothing, sacrificing it all to the greater good, only to be brought back to life like Christ, like the second coming of Christ, I guess, right? And then you get to continue on as if it never happened, right? But we don't, that doesn't seem to really address the problem of the permanence of death as a real reality that you have to deal with, right? However, there were philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche who suggested this idea of the eternal return. That what if instead of going through a process of reincarnation, where after dying you get reborn in a different kind of life and you either get rewarded or punished based on your life, what if your reincarnation was just to start your same old life again, back, with the same people, the same city? So this idea that even if you died or you killed yourself, you just had to do it all over again, right? what if that was your situation, and you could never escape this one reality you were given, right? But you were just stuck with that for all eternity. And for every petty little bullshit melodrama thing that caused you to create pain and suffering in other people's lives, you just had to live through that again and again and again. And why the fuck would I, and why would I, until you realize that maybe you could do something different, right? But then or is there even free will? A scientist suggests we don't even have free will, that we don't even have volition to make a change, to live life in a better way. So that if you're driven by petty revenge and bitterness and jealousy, then you have no control over that. You will just follow those things like a dumb, like you are just responding to external stimulus like an animal with no ability to make a better choice, right? But there's a thing about like the Zizekian thing. I was mentioning this Zizekian idea that he talks about the idea of like, if you're upper class, if you're to be like, there's this whole thing about being at the very top of the pyramid and then having the privilege to sort of make this gesture that you are nothing and that you're making the ultimate sacrifice. And that, but then if you were to see somebody who was a red shirt, just like one of these guys who's like the engineering, like the guy who is Scotty's kid, right? The guy, or not Scotty's kid, Scotty's nephew. There's going to be it scales down basically, so that there's, at some basic level, there's all these people who are in the engineering room, and every time the Enterprise gets hit by a torpedo, a few of these random no names dies, right? And you've got these people, so you've got a world where you've got these people who are considered like celebrity figures that everybody knows and respects, and that when some famous person dies, everybody, I've never, you can say I don't have a connection personally to David Bowie, but his music made so much for me and meant so much to me, and then David Bowie dies, and when, all these famous rock stars and heroes of ours die, we mourn them, but then when, every day there's some no-name person that is an unknown who nobody gives a shit about. Nobody's gonna send this person, nobody's gonna be like, oh well, you died, but it's okay because we've got this miraculous Genesis device that will just bring you back, and we can do this whole thing where we don't have to deal with the reality of death. We can just be stuck on the same loop, and we can just be like, oh, let's just reboot the same bullshit over and over and over again, and not actually deal with the permanence of death. Right? And the mourning of death. We can just live in a kind of a pop cultural world where you just get to reboot the same thing endlessly, and nobody ever ages and nobody ever grows old, and then you can just replace all the actors with new like that kind of thing. And like why the new Star Trek just doesn't vibe with me, or why reboot culture tends to be a bit tired. But Star Trek II Wrath of Khan is interesting precisely because Star Trek II Wrath of Khan is a reboot. That's what makes it great, is that it's like it's an original and a reboot at the same time, because it's bringing back the character Khan that was in the 1960s thing in a rebooted motion picture version, right? So it's a reboot, but it's also the original, right? But it's not the real original. Right? But it's having this sort of, the plot line has a meta commentary on the whole problem of the red shirt, but it solves this problem by giving the whole crew the red shirts, right? The whole crew has the red shirt now. So and that also coincides with the death of Spock. If every one of your crew is wearing red, it means that you are sacrificing your class privilege. That it's just a bunch of underclass people that are put in the firing line. That your ass in the fucking commander seat is just has the same mortal weight on it, right? But there's this kind of thing that you're kind of like, when you deal with it as somebody who's up on the top of the pyramid, you make a big deal about it. For you, it's just this big thing about like you transcending your ego and making the ultimate sacrifice. But the fact is that people are doing it every day, and it's just the way our world works, right? And it's our privilege that has created this hierarchical system where one is separated from the other, or that the idea of being nobody is now placed at the top of the pyramid to somehow mean that being at the top of the pyramid is not just about a fucking power thing. You're like, oh, I'm at the top of the pyramid. I get all the power. I'm right. I get to tell everybody what to do, and that also means that I'm also so selfless because like I deserve to be on the top of the pyramid because I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it because I care about all of you so much that I would just die like a martyr to save you. And that means that how dare you come after me, right? Like for because like and criticize because I would give it all away in a second. I would sacrifice it all, right? But then meanwhile, what tends to happen is that it tends to be people at the bottom who are sacrificing it all, and other people making these kinds of like gestures and stuff like it's a kind of a spectacle, right? And this is going to reinforce by Star Trek because the Genesis device, it's like the gesture that you're giving it all up, that you're sacrificing. They're like, oh well, thanks anyways. It's not a real sacrifice. We'll just bring Spock back. Thanks, Spock. Oh, like, weren't we lucky to have this guy who sacrificed his ego, that he's willing to give up everything, for us, and then but we can just bring him back. I mean, like, don't worry about it. It's like we're gonna do as many movies with Spock as you want, and then we can just get another actor to play him, right? And then just do it forever, right? But there's another thing about this with the progressive coding of Star Trek, that they are in the red shirt has another significance, right? That it's basically a kind of a Marxist code, right? Because I mean the United Federation of Planets they've transcended the need for monetary exchange. If you need food, you get food, and you don't have to pay for it, right? If you're working on the ship of the Enterprise, it's like an open bar, basically, is the idea. Like that, they have created a system that has so much prosperity and affluence, and they've got an infinite galaxy of planets to explore and create a peaceful trade federation with. That they've transcended the need for this sort of like the barter and exchange thing is seen to be kind of primitive, and they have allocated the resources in such a way that you don't need to work for money and all your needs are taken care of. But it's kind of like this sort of Marxist, you are expected to contribute, and if you are talented as a science person, it's like they're basically like, this is the thing, they're basically communists, right? Star Trek is basically communism, and it goes with this whole Soviet idea of like transcending the old superstitions of the old religion and stuff like that, and creating a kind of a rationalist society based on, if we can solve the problems of pain and suffering with logic and rationality, then we're not stuck in some sort of primitive belief system that like, oh, we suffer because God, we did something wrong and it's our payment to God for being sinners to suffer, and that we just have to we see this as a superstition, a fairy tale, and that we can use our rational science, engineering, technology to engineer all these problems out of existence and create a prosperous society for everyone. And that it's basic, but this is not in dichotomy to religion and spirituality. It's actually a kind of devotion to an ideal of higher logic, an ideal of a higher mind, of like the idea that God is a kind of the pure reason, right? Or a kind of pure intelligence, that you can say that like, oh, you've got a society where the majority of people are suffering and a few people are incredibly affluent and rich and prosperous. Like, is that a rational way to structure society? From the point of Star Trek, I don't know, they don't really lay out the argument. From Spock's point of view, it's simple logic that this does not compute. That does not compute to have a society where most people suffer for the good of the good of the few at the top. And this is basically a kind of a mystical Gnostic Marxist synthesis, where the Star Trek universe is a kind of, and then that whole ideal of like making the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the many, as a kind of that sacrifice has redeemed itself in a kind of rebirth, brings us into Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is essentially the same idea, right? It's a kind of a Gnostic myth about the kind of like the people, this kind of secret society who are at the pinnacle, like it's kind of like the Illuminati or whatever, right? Who are creating a project to transform Earth, right? To bring about a kind of a recreation that will apparently eliminate all the pain and suffering. And there's something very specific though about Neon Genesis Evangelion, rather than the whole conversation about Gnosticism, but that I think goes with this whole thing about the death of Spock and the death of the red shirts. In that a lot of people online, I mean, I don't spend much time on social media anymore, but yeah, I saw this criticism. I mean, I don't know, like, it is what it is. There's a certain kind of person who's like a real anime fan who doesn't who thinks Evangelion is overhyped, and there's a lot of kind of people that aren't. I mean, I don't know. I'm more the kind of person who watches like Ghost in the Shell, Princess Mononoke, Paprika, Perfect Blue, all these classic animes. But I'm not like, it's hard. Some of them are just real gems, and then there's a lot of it that just, I don't know. I don't think they're making it with me in mind. I don't know. It's not really my scene, right? So I don't attach that much. I like the good stuff, and I would love anime if there was just more good stuff, right? And from my point of view, Evangelion is like about as good as it gets, right? And one of the criticisms from the people that are considered to be anime fans that don't privilege Evangelion over other anime, they criticize Evangelion because no, their criticism of it was that like nobody dies in it, right? Or that there isn't this drama. Like there's this thing where Anno, the creator of Evangelion, was apparently very precious about his characters, and there's some kind of like there's something about the way that he did the end of Evangelion. You had to make sense of the way that he did the ending. You have to keep that in mind. This thing about how there is a tendency. There's like, you contrast it with Game of Thrones, right? Or so many other, like, I just started trying to watch the new Dune series, and it's just like they introduce a character, they kill them off. There's something about how characters on TV shows are very disposable. There's a whole, every night there's a new victim, every night there's a new crime or something like that. And with Anno was very like treating his characters as if they were people, that they were like, it's like you don't want to, you're creating that. It would be like doing violence to somebody who is your friend or something like that, to be write a character and then just kill them off coldly, right? Like it was like there's a kind of like he treats there's something about, that's what's weird about watching Wrath of Khan, is that there's something about, as a kid, you don't really question it. It's just you're just used to this pop culture environment. But then there's something about Evangelion is just so much better, but it's because there's so much more soul in it, right? But he's taking the same basic conversation, but just like, I think Miyazaki said that like Anno is a guy who basically he's just like making himself bleed for his audience. He's basically he's like torturing himself and like ripping his heart out and like showing it to you to be like, and you don't get that from most franchise science fiction stories. You don't get this quality, like the person is so much invested in it that they like, to hurt their characters would be like to hurt them, right? Like you are to have somebody suffer in that show would be like the creator themselves is suffering. To have a character die in that show is like killing the creator. Like you're it's like you are stabbing me in the heart by killing this character. So he's approaching it from that level where people aren't just like, this is the whole point. You don't live, the whole point is you do not live in a world where people are just disposable items that you get to kill and throw away and then bring them back the next movie as if never happened and then pretend like everything's okay, right? But the funny irony is that this is actually precisely what he does, because in the Evangelion, like the ending of it is that everybody, like he like, for the people that are upset that he doesn't do this thing where he just creates characters and kills them off, he gives them what they want in the most brutal way, that it's just sort of like, it's like some of the most like difficult death scenes to watch in media, right? And there's a real sense of grief around it that you don't get from other stories who just treat this in a kind of, and it's like if you see how like Captain Kirk treats the death of Scotty's nephew and how just like cold and insensitive that is, um, versus the way that Anno treats the death of his kid. There's like so it's like you can take the same basic like science fiction kind of premise and but like load it with so much more like soul and resonance, and it's just and that what makes it like this is a piece of art, and that just starts to feel like something stuck, like some sticky thing stuck to the bottom of the movie theater that you're going to call the janitor to go clean off, right? Like so there's this kind of idea of like what real art means versus this is kind of like pop culture trash factory. But the funny thing about Anno is that he combines it, right? That there is the it somehow does the job of being both, and also being like a industry for selling endless figurines of like anime girls or whatever, right? It has its own trashy quality, but it's like it manages to do both the profane and the transcendent all in one go. But it's just kind of funny because it's like I didn't realize that there's so much going on between Evangelion and Wrath of Khan, right? And then you could even also say there's this thing about the way the clinging of the petty passions and stuff like that, and the way that like he has this feud, like there's a feud between Shinji and Asuka, where that like when they get reincarnated, it's like the reincarnate, like oh, there's all these different alternate endings, but like, different things that happen. But the main ending is like they get reincarnated, and it's just like Shinji choking Asuka. It's not you're not getting reincarnated into some world that's made anew and everything's fresh and shiny and new again. You're the world that's being reincarnated is where what point of your soul's evolution is holding you back, or where you're stuck, where you're holding on, where there's some pain clinging, where they've got their claws in you, right? And that's goes back to Wrath of Khan, right? It goes back to Wrath of Khan, where there's this like the new story is like it's not some new shining idealistic thing. It's like who's the guy, the old barbarian who's been stranded out in space, who hasn't caught up with the rest of us yet, right? And this idea that like we in life we all try to be civilized people and try to create a fair and just society and all this stuff, but we still have these barbarians. There's still this kind of barbarism, whether that's in your own life, or whether that's in the society, or whether that's like your own. We have our own emotional barbarism or something, right? Where we are just like there's some part of us that won't give up the grudge, won't let go, won't just has the same petty bullshit driving it, right? And the idea of it goes with this idea of reincarnation, that like when you're brought back to life and when you're reincarnated, it's like we got to work out where the lowest shit has its grip on you,